Good afternoon, Leanne. Welcome to our chat, and thank you so much for agreeing to come and talk a little bit about your experience of, knowing Paul, and also writing a chapter for our book, Brains Inspiring Businesses. Your chapter is called Thinking of Others, and it has amazing insights, and we want to just talk about a few of them as we go along. So my first question to you is, tell me a little bit about how you got to know Paul, and when he contacted you about the book, how did you come to this topic?
Thank you, Nandini, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you, who, of course, also, had such a wonderful relationship with Paul, and who was such a great influence in so many of our lives. So how did I come across Paul Brown initially? I'll start there. So I was many years ago, we'll just say plus 8 years ago now, and for many years prior, fascinated by the subject of workplace bullying and workplace incivility.
Right.
I came to realise that in our workplaces around the Western world and beyond, we don't have a language to talk about how we talk to each other. And that's because we didn't have a pair of glasses on to look at what was occurring socially at work and the interactions we shared, the signals of threat that we would send to each other, and the signals of trust, through our face, our voices, our body language, and our words. And I got to the point in my work, facilitating teams and organizations through programs online and face-to-face, to have that conversation and build that shared awareness and that shared language. I got to the point where I think, well, what does the brain have to say about this? What does the brain have to tell us about what is the signal of threat in our social interaction? What does it look like? What does the brain code as a potential social threat in the environment? And so I went on the hunt for postgrad work in this field in applied neuroscience. Well, I was on the hunt for a long time. Back in those days, a lot's changed in the past, 5 to 10 years. But I found Professor Paul Brown. And suffice to say, to fast track through that, discovery and enrollment into his, at the time, MSc in organisational neuroscience, I will never forget hearing Paul's voice for the first time. And lo and behold, he opened up the world and the subject for me by talking about, explaining, of course, the role of the amygdala at the base of the limbic system, its role in scanning for, scanning stimuli for emotional information, to understand the emotional significance of the event, to load emotion onto the neurons. If, for example, we pick up a signal of threat, we say good morning and someone snaps a curt morning back to us, threat response, load that potential fear emotion onto the neurons and distribute up through the cortical network. Paul's telling me this story and the group this story in his beautiful, informed, wizened, dulcet tones, and I am hooked. This is the place for me. This is the world for me.
Yes, and his ability to give, such elegant explanations for things that we've been looking out for years, and suddenly, it all falls in place.
Exactly.
Yeah, so he had the gift of language, as we know.
He sure did.
Yes. So this is interesting. And, you said that this whole explanation about the threat perception and how threat perception is informed by so many factors, and it's different for all of us, really. So, and there's so much good work going into this right now. But I think all of us need to question our own threat perception. To kind of think about our behaviors, really. So tell me a little bit more about your chapter, Thinking of Others. How did this come about, and why did you feel the need to write this chapter?
Yes, so I guess a few years on into my research and work, in this space, thinking about how the brain processes threat, and considering the fear as, this primordial emotion that the brain's, systems are so busy managing for us in our non-conscious systems as well as our conscious systems. And so a space of real interest for me was how to disrupt that threat response and that state of fear, particularly in the context of, anxiety attacks and panic. And I found myself in a plane conversation one evening off on a work trip with a fellow who next to me was talking about his fear of flying, and he was saying he'd worked to overcome that, and that he'd also worked to overcome a fear of heights. And he was telling me in short form about this extraordinary experience he'd had years earlier where he was walking in a rainforest, wanted to climb this viewing tower, but had this fear of heights. But he thought, hang it, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to conquer this fear. And he got about halfway up the tower with his palms sweating, his throat tight, his chest pounding, his stomach in knots, and went into a fully blown panic attack and was frozen, stuck to the tower. And how frustrated he was, and he was, he couldn't get further, and eventually managed to get down. But the second time he tried this at the end of his holiday, thinking he wasn't prepared to give up on this challenge, he got to the same point, climbing the tower in the same state of panic, but came across another man who was stuck to the tower. And he was in a fully blown panic attack. And he said, come on, mate, I'm going to help you. You're okay. You will be okay. We're going to climb this tower together. I'm going to stay with you and we'll do it. So that opened up this world for me. I'd already been thinking about what is it that could possibly shift the brain out of a fully blown state of panic. You know what that's like.
Yes.
What neuronal force could possibly be power enough to shift that? And that suggested to me that force was empathy. And I thought, well, how does that work? So I began sort of digging more and more, and I found out about this little region in the lower prefrontal cortex, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and its role, the strong role that is associated with this region of the brain in producing empathy in a mindful, conscious way, but its twinned role in the down-regulation of fear. So that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex was telling me that actually these functions are conjoined, that empathy and regulation of fear are connected, and in fact that actually, if we want to manage fear, that shift in the brain's focus of attention and energy off self and to other is the way to do it.
Yes, and I found that so powerful and yet so simple. Sometimes the simplest things are actually the more effective and powerful ones. And as we know that in a state of panic, our energy actually flows inward and
Absolutely.
not outward. But this simple act of thinking of another person very easily shifts the energy outward, and then everything else is possible in the internal system for us to probably regain some kind of balance. And I really, really liked her example, in the book. And the other thing is that you bring out some really interesting concepts. The fact that definitely about shifting state from fear to empathy, and how that changes the neurochemistry of the mind and body. The fact that the mind is more powerful than the brain, and just letting our mind direct us and change the way our brain is functioning in the moment, especially, with emotions. And the other thing which I really liked about your book is when you talk about compassion and, how compassion changes the neurochemistry of the brain. So very, very powerful concepts out there. Would love to have you comment a bit more on some of these.
Thanks, Nandini. So yes, I was reading some interesting studies in regions of the brain associated or highly activated in people with conditions that I would call disorders of the self. Anxiety, hypochondria, bulimia, a range of conditions where, for example, the insula in the midbrain becomes highly active and overactive and enlarged. So I'm thinking, well, how do we shift that brain state out of that entrapment of self and into the state of the other? Where, again, I was looking at the functions of regions around the ventromedial PFC associated with cognitive empathy that are, of course, part of the conscious self-aware realm of the brain. And as Paul would always say, we must shift the emotion to shift the thought. And I noticed that some of these, the ventromedial PFC is a region involved and activated in states of prayer and compassion, suggesting that entering into mindful states, particularly, for example, meditative practice or prayer where we're focused on care for the other, actually really help to unlock our resources and of care for the other that we can actually consciously practice it through these methods and through simply just, quietening down the self and the voice to shift that emotional state into one of compassion. And that when we do that, of course, we check that while we're not paying attention to ourselves, actually, we go off and do our best work and in a state that is quite free from fear and anxiety.
Thank you so much. There's one more question that I really wanted to, ask you. You have seen our book, and you know what the contents of the other chapters are. So my question to you is, why do you think a leader should read this book, or why do you think anybody in the work world would read this book or should read this book?
Yes, well, Nandini, we were touching on this earlier, weren't we? It never ceases to amaze me the extent to which we are leaving the brain out of the conversation around organizational development and how to improve the lives, the well-being, the performance and productivity of people without really understanding the brain's role in shaping it all.
Yes.
And if we look at, for the example I was using earlier, around the start of the conversation around the signals we send to each other, how the brain unlocks its resources of creativity, of innovation, of problem solving, of listening. When we are in a state of trust with each other, we have a profoundly social brain. And understanding that social brain is the key to unlocking life and experience in the organizations that we participate in every single day. And in that book, there is just so much insight, rich insight to apply from these, this incredible group of experts and researchers and practitioners who all lead and coach with the brain in mind. So, why would you not is perhaps the better question.
Yes, true. And as you were just explaining, it just struck me that our brain actually likes shortcuts or heuristics to remember.
Oh, it does.
Right? So, and I was thinking that your chapter title is almost like a heuristic. It's like thinking of others, like if you're in trouble, if you're in panic mode, if you're having fear, outsized fear reaction. Think of others. It's a very
Yes,
simple
it
thing to
really
remember.
is. We can we can. It really practice entering that state. I've done that in coaching with leaders where, for example, I had a leader speaking to me and talking about how she just, she loved all the aspects of her role. She loved her team and her content, but she was terrified of public speaking and leading meetings. And so, to help shift her thinking, I shared that story and I said, these people around this table are looking to you for help. 9 times out of 10, they turn up to that table. They're lost. They're worried. They're confused. They're looking, you're the expert. You have an extraordinary knowledge and you're a point of real calm and assurance for them. Don't deny them that, recognize that they're actually feeling more vulnerable than you are. And just shifting that thinking and that emotion, and then the thought, helped her really, I guess, unlock out of that state and shift her focus of attention off herself and onto the others. And while she was doing that, then she was able to, be her best self and perform and lead and speak and guide that room without the worry of the self. And in a climate now socially where, there's such a focus on mental health, which is great. But what comes with that, if we're not careful and vigilant, is a shift to focus on the self to a point of obsession and look for the fixes to self within self by looking after self more. And while a level of self-care is important in our lives, if we overplay that narrative for the brain and tell ourselves that story too much, we'll miss out on what I believe the brain is telling us is the very key to unlock us, which is our role of care and compassion and empathy for others. That actually is where we ourselves flourish.
Thank you so much, Leanne. And there is so much more to unpack in this. However, we are constrained by time, and hopefully we are going to keep spreading our message.
We are.
And thank you very, very much for being a part of this and contributing to the book and, talking about the brain and the mind and compassion. Thank you.